Generally speaking, exposure is the total amount of light allowed to fall on the image sensor. Every picture you take has an exposure. The picture can be underexposed, overexposed, or it can be perfect for what you're wanting the picture to communicate. Ultimately, there is no such thing as correct exposure because a scene can be exposed in a variety of ways depending on what you want your picture to emphasize and communicate. There are three elements that make up exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's explore how each of these elements affects the outcome of a picture. The aperture controls the amount of light that reaches the camera's sensor by size and intensity. The aperture is similar to the pupil in your eye. As light decreases, the pupil in your eye opens wider to let in more light. When the light increases, the pupil gets smaller to reduce in size the amount of light entering the eye. Aperture settings can be used creatively to control the depth of field in a picture. Depth of field is the zone of apparent focus in a picture. It is apparent because a lens only focuses at one point and has a plane of focus parallel to the plane of the image sensor. Depth of field means that it looks like there's more in focus than there really is. This area of focus extends in front and behind the true point of focus. The size of the aperture determines the depth of field. The smaller the opening, larger f-stop number, the more depth of field. Therefore, f22 has a lot more depth of field than f2.8. Think of it this way: bigger f-stop number, bigger depth of field. With lots of depth of field, you get lots of detail. By using a smaller f-stop number, a wider opening, you'll get a shallower depth of field and less detail overall, besides what you're actually focused on. When an aperture is opened up by a full f-stop, the amount of light which reaches the sensor is doubled. For example, if you set the f-stop to 2.8, the aperture is going to be wide open. This type of setting is used when you want to isolate your subject from the background or make the subject the primary focus in the picture. An f-stop setting of f8 would increase the area around the subject that is in focus. Opening the aperture further will continue to enlarge the area in the picture that will be in relative focus. For example, if you set f-stop to f22, the aperture will have a small opening, and everything in the frame will be in focus. Remember, the smaller the f number, the larger the aperture or opening. The larger the f number, the smaller the aperture or opening. The second part of exposure is the camera's shutter speed. The shutter speed controls how long the light reaches the sensor. A fast shutter speed will freeze a moving object, and a slow shutter speed will blur a moving object. Fast shutter speeds are good for shooting subjects that move quickly. Slow shutter speeds are useful when you want to blur the action. This can be good if you're trying to capture the movement of water or streaks of light at night. An extremely fast shutter speed of 1000 or 4000 could be used to freeze the motion of a bee's wing while in flight. A setting of 500 to 1000 could be considered a fast shutter speed and would be used for freezing the movement of an animal or an athlete. Slowing the shutter speed to a moderate speed of 125 to 500 is ideal for portrait settings. Slower shutter speeds in the range of 8 to 60 are good for blurring motion in pictures. Blurring motion can produce some great effects in running water and human movement. An extremely slow shutter speed found in the range of 8 to 30 would ideally be used for shooting scenes at night, or if you want everything in focus on an up-close shot of a product or item you want to post online. We recommend using a tripod for all slow shutter speeds under 60 in order to help keep images sharp and focused. Let's look at the relationship between aperture and shutter by using an analogy. You can think of the exposure like being a full bucket of water. The bucket, the exposure, can be filled in different ways. The water tap used to fill the bucket is like the aperture or opening on your lens. The amount of time you have to leave the water tap turned on to fill the bucket is like the shutter speed. The wider the tap is open, the more water will come through the nozzle into the bucket. This means the tap will only need to be open for a short amount of time. If the tap only has a narrow opening, on the other hand, water will only trickle into the bucket, and you'll need to leave the water turned on for a much longer period of time to fill it up. Aperture is related to shutter speed in a similar way. If the aperture is small, you'll need to have a slower shutter speed to gather enough light to create the proper exposure. If the aperture is large, however, you'll need to have a faster shutter speed to create the same effect. You can fill the bucket by opening the tap or aperture full blast for a short time, the shutter, or you could close down the tap to a trickle for a long time. Either way, you'll get a full bucket of water, the exposure. And finally, the third piece of the exposure puzzle is ISO. ISO is the image sensor's sensitivity to light. The higher the sensitivity, the less light is needed to make an exposure. In auto mode, the camera will automatically select the ISO for you. Most digital cameras have an option to change the ISO settings manually. Auto ISO generally works best for bright scenes. However, some situations will require a manual ISO setting. For example, when shooting an athletic event in low light, you'll want to set the ISO to a higher setting like 800 or 1600 and use a fast shutter speed, so you can capture the athlete in focus. The same idea works for ample light settings. If there is plenty of light, set the ISO to 100 or 200 and take the shot. Your pictures will be clearer when using a low ISO in good lighting conditions. You'll also notice digital noise with higher ISO numbers in low light situations. Low ISO numbers result in images with the least visible noise. The larger the ISO number, the more noise that can be introduced into your picture based on the lighting situations. The amount and degree of digital noise varies from camera to camera. As a general rule of thumb, it will be difficult to notice noise in ISO settings below 400. You'll get the best image quality by using the lowest ISO possible on your camera. If you're taking pictures where there is a lot of light, like outside on a sunny day, then using the lowest ISO on your camera will give you the best image quality. If you want to take pictures indoors where light may not be sufficient or in other low light situations, then you would need to use supplemental lighting with a flash or studio lights or select a higher ISO. The most common ISO numbers available with digital cameras are 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and 3200.